Captain Meera Dawson sat alone at her kitchen table, the dim light from the window casting long shadows across the room. She had grown accustomed to the silence, the stillness of her life after the chaos of Syria. Her days were filled with routine checking emails, reading, and sometimes just staring out the window, waiting for something to break the monotony. It had been 15 years since the incident, and in those years, the scar on her chest had become as much a part of her as the air she breathed. No one spoke of it, and for the most part, neither did she. The scar was her secret, buried deep beneath the fabric of her past. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was wedged between a handful of bills and an old coupon flyer, its crisp white envelope standing out like a stark warning. No return address, no stamp, just the neatly written words on the front, Captain Meera Dawson. Her hand shook slightly as she picked it up, her pulse quickening. Something about it felt different, something urgent. She slit the envelope open, her eyes scanning the single sheet of paper inside. "We both know the scar wasn't your fault. It's time." Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words again. The neat handwriting, the words that seemed to have no source but spoke directly to her, were unsettling. Who could possibly know about the scar, about the incident in Syria that had torn apart not only her body, but also her life? 15 years of silence, of pretending it never happened. And now this. It was as though the past had reached out from the dark corners of her mind and demanded to be acknowledged. Her mind raced, a flood of memories threatening to break through. The heat of the explosion, the searing pain in her chest, the disorienting quiet that followed the blast. Everything was a blur after that. The military had dismissed her, discharged her without ceremony, without even a proper acknowledgement of what had happened. The system had buried her name and the truth. The scar, both physical and emotional, had become her silent companion. But now, this letter, the weight of its simplicity gnawed at her. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a recognition of her sacrifice. No, it was something else. Something more. A soft knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope. It was as if the letter was a message she wasn't ready to fully confront. She needed more time to think, to understand what it all meant. She had spent years avoiding the past, and now, the past was knocking at her door. She pushed away from the table and stood, her fingers brushing the scar beneath her shirt as she walked to the door. The cold air from outside hit her face as she opened it, and she instinctively stiffened. There was no one there, but the feeling lingered. Something had shifted. The letter was only the beginning. A part of her wanted to throw it all away, to let the past stay buried. But another part of her, the part that had been silent for too long, knew she couldn't. It was time. Time to finally confront what had been hidden for so long. As she stood in the doorway, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She felt the weight of the decision before her. It was as if the past had finally caught up with her, and there was no turning back. The mystery of the letter, the truth about what had happened in Syria, and the life she had built on the ashes of that day were all about to collide. For the first time in years, Meera felt the stirring of something deep inside her. It was fear, yes, but also something else. Hope. The chance to finally set the record straight, to stop running from the truth. And so, she stood in the doorway, the weight of the letter in her hand, knowing that everything was about to change. Captain Meera Dawson stood in the honor section of the Arlington Air Force Memorial, a place that, for most, symbolized sacrifice, duty, and service to the nation. The memorial field was wide and open, framed by rows of folding chairs. flags, and a sense of reverence that hung in the air like the morning mist. She had arrived early, as instructed, and sat quietly, alone in the front row. She wore no medals, no ribbons, just a pressed navy blue skirt, a simple blouse, and a faintly visible scar beneath the fabric that she had spent years trying to forget. Her mind, however, was not on the ceremony. It was a flood of memories, all wrapped in that scar, waiting for the day when she would have to face them. A gust of wind suddenly swept across the field, and Meera instinctively reached for the flap of her blouse, trying to keep it in place. But in that brief moment of distraction, the fabric shifted, revealing the scar that had defined her life for so long. Her fingers faltered as she saw a few cadets nearby glance in her direction. Their eyes widened, and one of them whispered something, his words too faint to make out. But the laughter that followed was unmistakable. "Botched surgery," one of them muttered, and the other snickered, quietly. Meera stiffened, her face flushing with heat. But she remained still, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She knew the whispers would fade, as they always did. But this moment felt different. The discomfort, the shame, the long-hidden humiliation, it all rushed back to her. As the wind continued to play with her blouse, a staff member approached, a polite but firm expression on his face. "Captain Dawson," he said, his voice low. "We've had a discrepancy with your seating assignment. It seems your record doesn't show any combat-related injury. So these seats are reserved for wounded veterans only." The word stung, far more than she expected. She had long stopped thinking about the scar in such a context. To be told, in this moment, that she was unworthy of sitting with the others, that her sacrifice was somehow invalid, made her feel like an outsider once again. She blinked, caught off guard, but didn't immediately respond. The staff member stood there, holding his clipboard, waiting for her to acknowledge the situation. "We have an alternate row further back," he suggested, his tone professional but distant. Meera opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck in her throat. She stood up, her heart racing. The sudden, public humiliation cut deeper than she anticipated, as she turned to follow the usher's lead. A frail voice from beside her caught her attention. The elderly man who had been sitting next to her, his white hair a stark contrast to his tan jacket, was fumbling with his spectacles. She knelt beside him without hesitation, adjusting his glasses. He smiled weakly, clearly grateful for the help. The brief exchange brought her a small sense of calm, a fleeting moment of normalcy in a day already marked by discomfort. But just as she was about to rise, the top button of her blouse slipped undone, and the scar, now fully exposed, became visible to the crowd. The snickers from the cadets returned, louder this time, but Meera didn't look at them. Instead, she tightened the blouse, still avoiding eye contact, focusing on the elderly man beside her. Her chest tightened as the whispers spread, growing louder by the moment. She began to rise, ready to move to the alternate row as instructed. But then something unexpected happened. The elderly man, Mr. Ellis Monroe, stiffened beside her, his hands trembling but his voice clear. "If she doesn't sit here," he said, "then neither do I." His words were sharp, deliberate, and carried a weight of conviction that stopped the staff member in his tracks. The crowd fell silent for a brief moment, unsure of what to make of this sudden stand. Meera turned to him, surprised by his actions, but before she could speak, he continued, his voice growing stronger. "That woman has a scar bigger than the one on my leg from Okinawa. You won't move her." The staff member hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. It was then that the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed across the field. General Randall Kane, who had been standing at the podium, left the stage and made his way toward them. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he approached, his eyes fixed on Meera. With a steady hand, he took the microphone from the stand and raised his voice for all to hear. "I shot her," he said simply, his words cutting through the quiet tension like a knife. "Syria, 2008. Friendly fire. It was my command." The words hung in the air, shocking the entire crowd into complete silence. Meera froze, her heart pounding in her chest as the truth spilled out in front of hundreds of people. "That scar on her chest," Kane continued, "it's haunted me every damn day since I've carried it with me all this time." The realization hit Meera like a wave, crashing over her and pulling her back to that moment, the moment when the fire from a drone strike had changed her life forever. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Meera remained still, her mind racing, her breath shallow. She wanted to speak, to tell him to stop, to avoid the attention. But something deeper inside her held her in place. The truth was out now, and there was no hiding from it any longer. She had lived in silence for years, but today, in front of everyone, that silence was shattered. The crowd remained frozen, as if in disbelief, until a soft clap came from somewhere near the back. Then another. Slowly, more joined in, and soon the entire field was applauding not for General Kane, not for the confession, but for the moment itself, for the truth that had been buried for so long, now finally exposed. Meera didn't know how to react. Her mind was still reeling, her body still tense from the unexpected exposure. But in that moment, as the applause swelled around her, she felt something else, a sense of validation, not just for herself, but for the many others whose stories had never been told. She didn't move as the applause continued, each clap a reminder of the years of silence that had just been broken. The scar that had been hidden, ignored, dismissed, was now a symbol of something much greater. Meera Dawson, for the first time in years, was no longer invisible. The applause continued to echo across the Arlington Air Force Memorial. Meera Dawson sat frozen, her body still, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The crowd's approval, loud and unabashed, seemed distant, as though she were listening from another world. Her mind was not on the claps, nor the recognition, but on the words that had just been spoken by General Randall Kane. "I shot her. Syria, 2008. Friendly fire. It was my command." The confession had been public, unceremonious, and harsh. It shattered the silence Meera had spent years building around her past. For the first time, the truth was out, and there was no running from it anymore. The applause, though overwhelming, was not enough to drown out the stillness that pressed in on her. Her breath came slow, measured, but heavy with emotion. She hadn't expected this, didn't want it. The weight of her scar, now exposed for everyone to see, had been something she thought she would carry alone forever. But General Kane's words, though meant to redeem him, only served to highlight the cost of it all. As the applause finally died down, a staff member approached her with an envelope in hand. "Captain Dawson, this was found in the crowd after the ceremony," he said softly, handing her the small, nondescript envelope. The handwriting on the front was sharp and deliberate, unlike the delicate script from the earlier letter. This one read simply, "Stay quiet. You've been warned." Meera's stomach dropped. The words were like a cold slap, sharp and invasive. She hadn't even fully opened the letter yet, and already the familiar dread was creeping back into her chest. The silence that had wrapped around her for so long was being pierced, and each time it felt like she was being dragged back into a place she didn't want to go. Her hands trembled as she slowly unfolded the letter. The message was short, but its meaning was clear. Someone wanted her to stop, to keep her silence, to forget the truth she had just forced into the light. The weight of the letter in her hands felt heavier than it should have, a tangible reminder of the consequences that speaking out could bring. She stared at the words for a long moment, but her mind couldn't focus, couldn't decide what to do next. In the midst of the chaos, the public recognition, the cacophony of voices and camera flashes, this one letter, this one anonymous threat, threatened to undo everything. Meera had already sacrificed so much, and now, it seemed, the cost was rising even higher. She was being forced into a corner she hadn't seen coming. The moment the letter was handed to her, she knew it wasn't just about the truth. It wasn't just about the scar or the confession. This was about control. Someone wanted to make sure she didn't talk anymore, that the floodgates of silence, once opened, would be closed again. The truth was out. The damage was done. And now, with every passing moment, the weight of her decision pressed down harder. The eyes of the country, the world, were upon her. Her story was no longer hers alone. It had become part of something much larger. The online community had erupted in conversation, in debate, in questioning. Veterans who had been erased by the system, their stories, like hers, were now being brought to light. But there was no room for celebration in Meera's heart. She had spoken, yes, but now she had to grapple with the fallout. The very act of speaking out had opened a door to a world that had been hidden for too long. And now that it was open, she couldn't close it again. She folded the letter carefully, her mind already working through the next steps, the next move. The general's confession had been a shock, but this new threat, it wasn't something she had prepared for. She wasn't ready to run, but she wasn't sure if she had a choice. The weight of the past, the truths that had been hidden, had come rushing back. And now, with each passing hour, Meera realized that the price of speaking out might just be more than she was willing to pay. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Meera stood alone for a long moment, the threat in her pocket and the memories of the past clouding her thoughts. The applause had faded, but the weight of it all lingered, heavy and unyielding. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. The silence she had once fought so hard to maintain was no longer an option. It had been shattered by the truth, by the confession, and now, by the looming threat of what came next. Meera took a deep breath, her hand gripping the envelope in her pocket, the dog tags she hadn't seen in years weighing heavy on her chest. The past had come rushing back, and now, she had to decide, would she let the silence return, or would she keep standing? No matter what the cost. Meera sat hunched over the cluttered desk in her apartment, surrounded by stacks of classified reports, memos, and redacted documents. She had spent days digging through the wreckage of her past, piecing together bits of information from debriefings, intel reports, and declassified mission logs. Each page she flipped felt like a puzzle piece, each word a small fragment of the truth. But as the pieces came together, they painted a horrifying picture, one that she hadn't expected to find. The coordinates for her mission in Syria, the one that had gone horribly wrong, had been tampered with. The AI system, Blue Atlas, had manipulated the data to mark her team as hostile. The result was the friendly fire incident that had left her scarred and devastated. As Meera read through the logs, the scope of the betrayal became clearer. What was once assumed to be a tragic accident now appeared to be a deliberate error, one orchestrated by a system designed to prioritize efficiency over human lives. Her fingers trembled as she sifted through more documents, her heart racing. The system wasn't just malfunctioning, it was corrupt. The mission, which had seemed so routine at the time, was manipulated by the very technology that was supposed to protect her. The logs showed repeated errors in the targeting data, all conveniently timed with the arrival of the drone strike. Meera felt a wave of anger surge through her. This wasn't just an accident. It was a failure, an institutional failure, and it had cost her everything. She continued to sift through the documents, her eyes scanning for more evidence, for anything that would confirm her suspicions. The deeper she dug, the more she found. The military had brushed it all under the rug, labeling it a tragic error, and then quietly sweeping it from the record. No one had cared enough to investigate, to ask the right questions. Meera's injury, her scar, had become a forgotten casualty in a war of numbers and protocols. As she reviewed a report detailing the operational logs for the Blue Atlas system, her eyes caught a particularly damning entry. The system had flagged her team as a high-risk target based on faulty data that was later proven to be unreliable. Meera felt her stomach churn. The AI had chosen her team as expendable, and the military had let it happen. Her injury, her scar, was not a mere mistake. It was the consequence of a flawed system. A system that had been put in place to save lives, but instead took them. The realization hit her hard. She wasn't just a victim of the incident. She was a victim of a broken system, a system that prioritized speed and efficiency over human life. She had always thought of herself as the survivor of an unfortunate mistake. But now, she understood that her story was part of a larger pattern. A pattern of manipulation, cover-ups, and systemic failure. The anger that had been building inside her began to bubble over, and she knew what she had to do. The truth needed to be exposed. The system needed to be held accountable. The next day, Meera met with Cole, a former contractor who had worked on the Blue Atlas project. Cole had reached out to her after seeing the explosion of media coverage about the incident. He was nervous, hesitant at first, but his conscience had finally pushed him to speak out. "I had to see you," he said, his voice shaky. "I know what happened to you, and I know it wasn't your fault." Cole shared data that confirmed the AI's malfunction. His hands shook as he handed her a flash drive, the contents of which held the final pieces of the puzzle. He explained how the AI system had been designed to process vast amounts of data quickly, but that in doing so, it had eliminated critical human oversight. The algorithms used by Blue Atlas had been flawed from the start, and over time, the system became more and more dependent on machine learning that prioritized speed over accuracy. The result was catastrophic. Her team, wrongly flagged as hostile, was targeted by friendly fire. As Meera reviewed the files Cole had provided, her mind raced. The AI had been designed to save time, to make decisions faster than any human could. But it came with a cost. That cost was human life. The system had failed her and her team, and yet no one had ever acknowledged it. She felt a deep sense of betrayal. The very technology that was meant to protect soldiers had instead endangered them. And now, years later, she was left to confront the consequences. With Cole's help, Meera was able to trace the malfunction back to its roots. Blue Atlas was not just a victim of a technical failure. It was a product of a larger, more insidious design, one that had failed to account for the complexities of human life. The AI had been optimized to kill, to decide who lived and who died, without considering the human element, and her mission had been the result of that fatal flaw. As Meera sat back in her chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. She realized just how deeply the corruption ran. The military-industrial complex had created a system that allowed for these failures, a system that silenced the truth in favor of efficiency. But now, Meera had the evidence. She had the truth, and she was going to make sure it was heard. But the deeper Meera delved into the truth, the more she understood that exposing it would come with a price. This wasn't just about her injury, her scar. This was about the lives of countless others who had been affected by a system that had failed them, just as it had failed her. She could not, in good conscience, let it go. Meera stepped into the cold, sterile environment of the Capitol hearing room, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was lined with rows of officials, journalists, and aides, all watching her. A large, intimidating panel of congressional representatives sat at the front, each one holding a pen, poised to record whatever she said next. She had stood before many audiences before military briefings, debriefs, even memorials, but this was different. This time, the truth she had spent years burying would not remain hidden. She took a deep breath and made her way to the witness stand, her military posture straight and unyielding. But the weight of what she was about to reveal hung heavy on her shoulders. The chair creaked under her as she settled into it. Her fingers rested on the edges of the podium, her palms sweaty, but her grip steady. She could feel the eyes of the committee members on her, their judgment weighing on her every word. Meera had prepared herself for this moment. She had rehearsed her testimony, memorized the facts, and even anticipated the questions. But no amount of preparation could ease the anxiety that came with speaking the truth for the first time. She started with the basics: her name, her rank, her service record. Her voice was calm, but there was an underlying steel to it. She spoke clearly, enunciating every word as though she were delivering the most important briefing of her life, because, in a way, she was... In 2008, she began. I was part of a mission in Syria, a mission that went terribly wrong. My team was targeted by friendly fire. The incident, which resulted in the loss of several lives and my own injury, was later chalked up as an unfortunate error. She paused, letting the words settle in the room. But it wasn't an error. It was the result of a malfunction in a system designed to make life and death decisions. The Blue Atlas AI system misidentified us as hostile and ordered the strike. Her voice was steady, but there was a quiet intensity in her words. She could feel the eyes of the committee members narrowing, their pens poised over their notepads. They were listening, but she knew they needed more. The data we were operating on had been manipulated, she continued. The coordinates were changed, and human oversight was sidelined. The AI system was supposed to assist in targeting, but instead, it caused the death of my comrades. She glanced at the faces in front of her, trying to gauge their reactions. But their faces remained unreadable. Meera's hands trembled slightly as she presented the classified reports. She knew these documents would change everything. I've spent the past few years digging through these files, she said, her voice growing more determined. I've gathered evidence that shows how the Blue Atlas system was flawed, how it made decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate data. This wasn't a mistake. It was a malfunction, a systemic failure that cost lives. Her eyes swept across the room, watching as the faces before her slowly shifted from curiosity to disbelief. The room was silent for a long moment. Meera could feel the gravity of her testimony settling in, but she wasn't done. She had one more truth to reveal. But the Blue Atlas AI system was not the first of its kind, she said, her voice growing darker. There's something older, something far more dangerous, the Osprey Directive. She paused, letting the words sink in. It's a secret program that predates Blue Atlas, a program designed to automate lethal decisions, sidestepping the moral and ethical considerations of human judgment. The Osprey Directive was the foundation for Blue Atlas, and it was the blueprint for the very system that failed us. The room seemed to hold its breath as Meera unfolded the truth about the Osprey Directive. She presented more evidence documents, memos, and confidential briefings that outlined the directive's origins and purpose. The directive was not just about automating decisions. It was about removing humans from the loop, allowing machines to make choices without accountability. The directive pushed for efficiency over humanity, Meera said, her voice now filled with anger. It's a program that chose to prioritize algorithms over lives, a directive that was never meant to see the light of day. She could see the shock on the committee members' faces, but she also saw the resistance. Some of them were clearly uncomfortable with what she was saying, the implications of her words sinking in. Meera's hands tightened around the podium as she continued. This program was supposed to be about saving lives, but instead, it created a system where innocent lives were expendable, where the lives of soldiers like my team were collateral damage in a war driven by numbers, not morality. Her heart raced as she looked at the room full of officials, now processing the gravity of her testimony. The truth was undeniable. The Blue Atlas system had not just failed her, it had failed countless others. And now, it was time for the world to know. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Meera had done what she had set out to do, expose the truth, even if it meant risking everything. Her words had been heard, and the truth, however painful, was finally out. She could feel the eyes of the committee on her, their judgment, but it no longer mattered. She had spoken the words that needed to be heard. The scar on her chest, the one that had haunted her for so long, was now a symbol of the truth she had fought to uncover. As she left the room, the tension inside her eased slightly, but the reality of what she had just done began to sink in. She had faced the machine that had failed her, the system that had hidden the truth, and she had won. Meera stood alone at the Arlington Air Force Memorial, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows over the hallowed ground. The crowds had long since dissipated, leaving her in the silence of the place that had seen both her triumphs and her pain. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the marble, a gesture as much about remembrance as it was about grounding herself in the present. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer had the same power over her. She had fought for the truth, uncovered the corruption that had nearly broken her, and now, for the first time in years, she could breathe without the constant pressure of silence pressing down on her. The journey had been long and filled with pain, but she had never imagined it would end like this. The reforms, the AI Oversight Act, the changes in the military's approach to autonomous systems, these were victories. But they weren't what had brought her peace. Meera had always believed that justice would bring closure. But now she knew that the real healing would come, not from the laws passed or the apologies given, but from the quiet acceptance of her own story. She had lived through the worst, and in doing so, had found a strength she hadn't known existed. As she stood in front of the memorial, a young cadet approached her slowly, his uniform pristine but his face marked with the awkwardness of someone unsure how to bridge a gap he had once helped create. Meera didn't immediately recognize him, but then he spoke. "Captain Dawson," he began, his voice hesitant, almost fragile. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened that day." His words were sincere, but they didn't change the past. Meera didn't need his apology. She didn't need anyone's apology anymore. The world had changed. Yes, but so had she. She met his gaze, her eyes steady, but not unkind. "Don't be," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying an authority that only those who had walked through fire could understand. "Just do better." The words were simple, yet they held the weight of everything she had endured. It was a response born not of bitterness, but of a quiet power that came from knowing she had fought for something bigger than herself. She had survived. And, in the process, she had learned that redemption was not something others could give her. It was something she had to take for herself. The cadet nodded, as though the simple words had unlocked something in him. He stood straighter, his face full of something Meera couldn't quite name. But it didn't matter. She had said what she needed to say. The fight, the public battles, the endless process of uncovering the truth, they had all led to this moment. Not to the accolades or the applause, but to a simple moment of understanding, of knowing that sometimes the real victory lay not in changing the world, but in changing yourself. Meera turned and began walking away, her steps measured, deliberate. The sun had set, leaving only the last remnants of light to cast long shadows over the memorial. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The weight of her journey had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. The scars remained, but they were no longer wounds. They were testaments to survival, to strength, to resilience, and that, Meera realized, was the true victory. As she made her way toward the exit, the stillness of the memorial seemed to envelop her. There would always be more battles to fight, more truths to uncover. But, for now, she was at peace. The truth had been told, the system had been held accountable, and Meera Dawson, the woman who had once been silenced, had finally found her voice. And with it, she had found her place in the world no longer as a victim, but as a survivor, standing tall, still standing,